So, the NCAA football championship game is set between Ohio State and Notre Dame University. This is the first championship game to be decided via a 12-team playoff game, and it features those teams. One, Ohio State, a perennial championship contender who only won 2 championships in the BCS era, and Notre Dame, a classic powerhouse who dominated in the old era from like the 1960s to the 90s with 11 championships in their history. But since that time, they haven't seriously sniffed a championship game but like once since then. You might think this is just an anomaly year for college football, which has in most of my lifetime been dominated by Southern teams, and that it will return to business as usual in future years. But I'm about to explain to you how sociological and economic factors will make this result and the future of college football look incredibly different than the college football most of you grew up seeing. Okay, so we got to start with some groundwork because I know a lot of you watching this will not watch me for sports. My sports videos never do that well, but I don't care. I'm gonna talk about them. And that means I have to give you a little more background than usual to make this make sense to anyone who is not a college football fan. So bear with me for those of you who do know a moment while I go over a little history and provide some historical context. College football has a lot of weird historical contexts, most of which upon inspection involves some serious shenanigans between teams wanting to be the best and doing some light to very heavy cheating on the rules a little bit. There's also historically been a ton of weird like laws and agreements between teams and conferences that made it so that the sport had really the absolute worst formula for crowning its annual champion over the last 75 years. To put it simply, the college football champion was essentially decided through a popularity contest. I know that sounds silly, but that's basically what it was. Up until 1998, in college football, the champion was decided by an expert committee of coaches and journalists and other various experts. It was based on in-season activity for wins and losses and like how people saw your talent, but it was never a situation where the best teams played the best teams to earn the right to say that they beat everyone to be the champion. This would often result in teams feeling like they got robbed of a national championship title just because they lost one game at the wrong time of the season. And often there were co-champions where 2 undefeated teams both were named champion by different committees. The shit was weird, and it was not like, for something as popular and great as college football, it was the worst possible way for them to decide the champion in their sport. And then in 1998, they finally came up with the BCS system, which would at least allow the number 1 and number 2 ranked teams to play each other for the championship. Sometimes this would result in absolutely amazing moments like Texas versus USC in 2005, arguably the greatest championship game of all time. But just the year before, we also got USC versus Oklahoma, which is arguably one of the worst championship games of all time. And this would still be very controversial because sometimes you would have 3 or 4 teams with legitimate arguments to be ranked 1 or 2, and they wouldn't get a chance to play.
We are ready now to unveil the 4 teams who will compete for the national championship in the first college football playoff. So let's take a look at the bracket right now, and we will start at the top.
Then finally, by 2014, they expanded it to 14 teams, which was pretty good, but still not perfect because there would still be teams that made it in but maybe didn't belong, such as TCU a few years ago, who somehow made it to the national championship, only to get dog-walked, no pun intended, by the University of Georgia. And it would still end up excluding really good teams like just last year when a 1-loss Florida State team didn't get in over a 2-loss Alabama team. So finally this year, the NCAA instituted a 12-team playoff, which if you ask me was probably 4 too many teams, but whatever, it worked and resulted in some amazing college football this postseason. But an interesting thing happened that, if you think hard about it, says a lot about the future of the sport. For 25 plus years during that BCS and early playoff system, the Southeastern Conference, aka the SEC, dominated the game. Schools like Alabama, Florida, and LSU won multiple championships in that era, with Alabama winning like 7, I believe. In the BCS era from 1998 to 2014, an SEC team won the game 9 times, and a Southern team in general won 13 out of 16 times, if you don't count Oklahoma as a Southern state, which I'm not quite sure. They might be West, Midwest, I don't know. The point is, it was still a lot. Then when you expand into the playoff era, an SEC team won 6 out of the 10 years and the Southern team won 8 out of the 10 years. So out of the 26 years of the modern era in NCAA football, an SEC team, which is the Deep South Conference, won 15 times. And when you include the ACC team, which has Florida and parts of the Carolinas in it, it goes up to 21. So the only non-Southern teams to win championships in the last 26 years have been Michigan once, Ohio State twice, Oklahoma once, and USC once. The other 21 times it's been won by a team in the South, in a good old red state. Remember that for later. When it comes to college football, the South truly did have something to say, or at least it used to. This year in the South, 5 teams went to the 12-team playoff. Perennial powerhouses Georgia, Texas, and Clemson, along with the constantly competitive Tennessee, and surprising upstart Southern Methodist University, or SMU, which is also in Texas. And all except for Texas were one and done, with Texas losing this past weekend in the semifinals to Ohio State. The playoff was dominated by Midwest and Northeast teams, Penn State, Ohio State, and Notre Dame. And those teams have always been high-powered teams that are competitors, but never really serious competitors for championships. Why all of a sudden are they better than their Southern counterparts that dominated for the last 25 years? And why do I think that's actually not going to change anytime soon? So aside from the big change of creating a playoff system, the real big difference, especially for teams like Alabama and Georgia versus a team like Notre Dame, are the new name and likeness rules, or NIL, and the transfer portal, both things that just started in NCAA football in the last couple of years. One of the worst things about college football historically has been the fact that this sport was making hundreds of millions of dollars for these schools through TV deals, brand deals, and merchandising. Yet the players who were literally shortening their lifespans and getting lifelong injuries to play such a brutal sport in these colleges were getting nothing but a free scholarship and weekly stipends that were sometimes so bad that players wouldn't be above petty theft to get money to buy fast food. There's a classic story from friend of the channel, Arian Foster, about how he called up his coaches and basically said they needed to find some ways to feed the players, or the players are going to start getting ignorant. And what's worse, if those players got caught getting money, if that coach would have gotten caught giving those players tacos, the whole team would be punished. For example, former Georgia Bulldog AJ Green was one of the best players in all of college football in the late 2000s. You could go to any sports store in Georgia and buy his jersey for $65, but none of that money went to him, even though it was his name on the jersey and his ability on the field that made the jersey valuable. But then when he sold his own personal jersey that he used to a sports collector in 2010 and got caught, he was suspended for 4 games. Players that developed any type of career outside of college football tangentially related to the fact that they were a college athlete, such as former football player turned Olympic hopeful skier Jeremy Bloom, or kicker turned YouTube sensation Destroy Ying, they were forced to either give up playing college football or give up their lucrative outside careers. And considering that the administrators of the sport were almost always old, rich white men, and that the players were almost always poor young black men with a healthy sprinkling of poor young white men, you can't not see the ugly reality that was at work here. It was incredibly exploitative, something that I talked about in an old main channel video at link that I'll put in the description. This all changed in 2021 when the NIL happened. Although still not a truly fair way of sharing resources, it at least allowed players to negotiate what are essentially influencer brand deals to have while they played college sports. This allowed for the top players to make hundreds of thousands, maybe even $1 million or more a year playing college football. It's still not perfect because it only really provided money for the top players, but it's an improvement. The other change was the transfer portal. In the old exploitative system, if a player decided to sign and play for a college football team, he was basically owned by that team. And if he wanted to leave that team for whatever reason, and there's often a lot of reasons a player might want to switch teams, he will be forced to give up a whole year of playing football in exchange. And this will be risky because it meant being away from the game for an entire year, and who knows what could happen in that year, and that would be longer than most players ever took a break from football. Meanwhile, coaches and administrators were perfectly fine with leaving teams whenever they wanted, which often would leave kids in situations they didn't want to be in, but they were stuck in. The transfer portal changed that, and now kids can leave at the end of the year regardless of the situation and play for a new team the following year. This has the result of turning the offseason into a mini free agency period because players will often enter the transfer portal looking for a team that will give them the best NIL deal. And while I personally am not a fan of players playing for 3 or 4 different college football teams in their short careers, it's better than the players being stuck in situations that don't serve them, being exploited by the system. It gives them more power in a sport where they are inherently depowered by the bigger overarching body of the NCAA. So you might be asking why this is all resulting in what looks like a major shift in who really holds power in the sport. If you know me and you made it this far, you already know where this is going. But for those of you who don't, let's get political and radical for a second. That's right, I tricked you. This was a woke video the whole time. Now you have to dye your hair blue and use gender neutral pronouns or you get sued by the woke mind virus. Welcome to the club. There's no turning back. So seriously though, let's talk about race and class for a moment. Why did the South always dominate college football? It's pretty simple. The South has the highest concentration of black people in the entire country and the highest concentration of poverty in the entire country. And those two things are very much related, especially in the South. This allows Southern teams the most fertile grounds for recruiting the best players in college football. Like in college football, teams have to go across the country looking at high school players to see who's the most naturally talented young players and convince those players to come to their college. This takes time and resources. It requires teams and coaches to have relationships with high school programs and communities and local coaches and trainers, etc. And it also means they have to really know who's truly a talented player and who's just being hyped up in his local community. And without getting into weird issues of bioessentialism, some of the best players in the country are always going to be in Texas, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, etc. And this gave teams in Texas, Florida, Georgia, and Alabama a huge advantage in knowing where to look for those players and building those relationships to get those players to come to their schools. These players also tend to grow up seeing these local teams and wanting to stay close to home in their families. So even with those really strong teams in the Northeast and the Midwest, like Ohio State and Penn State, you'll still see plenty of players on those teams coming from Texas and Georgia and Florida. Also, sports in general has always been a highly sought out way for young black men and some young white men to see themselves making it out of poverty. The NFL loves to show a doting black mama on the stage with their son getting ready to be drafted and change the life for himself and for her and the entire family at times. That's just the reality of the situation. There's probably some other things I get into there, but I don't want to get too woke for y'all. I know y'all are just, I'm just putting the tip in a little bit.
What?
So this gave the South a huge advantage to have the best players possible every year, and then also have a ton of control of them from NIL. And they also were cheating. Like, let's just keep it a buck. The Southern teams were always cheating. They were always paying players at a time when paying players was completely illegal. Teams in the South would always find sneaky ways to pay players under the table and fudge lines to make sure their players were academically eligible to play. Because although I personally don't think NCAA football should care that much about players' education, if the players are there specifically trying to get to the NFL, it is ostensibly a rule that the players have to be enrolled in college. And just keeping the buck, a lot of the players that play for some of these big teams, some of the best athletes, do not really have the grades or the acumen to be in these schools, if not for the fact that they played football. Yeah, so hearing that part back in the editing bay, that sounded a little wild, so I wanted to make sure I added some context just to make sure people didn't get the wrong idea. I'm not trying to cast aspersions on these young men who want to play football and want to go to college to access the opportunity to play for the NFL, or that like they don't deserve to go to college or anything wild like that. I'm just saying that historically, proponents of the NCAA system have always used the fact that these kids were getting a college education as a reason to not pay them what they're worth or compensate them fairly for everything that they're doing for these schools and on these teams. Fact of the matter is, and I know this from personal experience, having been around a lot of players at both the high school, college, and NFL level, a lot of these brothers are not overly concerned about education. They just know they can't get to the league without going to college first. And so it's not that they shouldn't value education or that education is of no value to them. It's that these schools know that these players are coming to the school for the NFL and is using the education aspect as a way to say, yeah, we're giving you an equal exchange here for your labor, when they definitely are not. Again, you can get my full thoughts on this in my How Black Athletes Are Exploited video, just in case this doesn't make enough sense to some of y'all. If it doesn't, it is what it is. Back to the video. Thus, there was constantly cheating and grade fixing, along with boosters and local businessmen who loved their team enough to give a couple of gifts, maybe get a car or two, hand over a little change to make sure a player comes to the team. Maybe they would pay for the whole family to get an apartment and move out of their poverty-stricken area. There's plenty of stories about white boys in the Midwest moving off of dirt farms to get to stay in nice apartments near where colleges played for those teams. The channel Secret Base, which does some of the best sports video essays out there, has a great docuseries on the culture of this happening in the South historically. But all this means that the South had a geographical and ethical, or more accurately, unethical advantage, and the results showed in what I talked about earlier, and the fact that all the champions, all the powerhouse teams were almost always coming from the South. And now all of this is probably going to change. I don't know about for the better, but definitely be very different. Cause see, that little couple $1,000s a player might get in the season, or the cheap apartment that they might get for their family, pales in comparison to the hundreds of thousands of dollars or $1 million check that they're gonna get from a school like Oregon, way out on the West Coast near Silicon Valley, where plenty of people have the money to spend. Now, if a player who isn't all that interested in their education, which again, I don't think is anything wrong with that, if they want to leave the school that recruited them to go somewhere else where they'll get more money, there's little reason for them to stay. There's nothing stopping them. And what this means is that powerhouse schools in poor states like Alabama and Louisiana are going to be hard pressed to compete with wealthier states in the North and the West Coast and the Northeast and the Midwest, because those states just don't have the monetary infrastructure to pay players like the other states do. Greg Bryan, the athletic director of the University of Alabama, was just begging his fans on Twitter to donate to their NIL fund because they know they won't be able to keep up for long. Furthermore, schools like a Notre Dame, or maybe in the future a Stanford, who could barely keep up as national powerhouses in the BCS era because their school admission standards are much higher, can suddenly compete because although they still probably won't get the best possible players, what they will have is continuity. Again, a lot of players going to the best teams are not necessarily the types of kids that will be going to the highest tier colleges if they weren't football players. But that also means they'll be less concerned about what a college has to offer them other than a spot on the football team and a nice amount of money. Conversely, a team like Notre Dame can build a culture and continuity which allows them to keep up because they don't lose players at the same rate, because when those players came to Notre Dame, they came there because of the culture of Notre Dame and because of the academics. And that's why a much less talented team like Notre Dame beat a team like Georgia, because Georgia was putting 10 to 15 brand new players on their team every year, whereas Notre Dame has players that have been there for 3 years straight, learning the system, getting acclimated to the culture, and building a more cohesive unit. So yes, what we're talking about here is how capitalism and socioeconomics is going to fundamentally shift the balance of power in NCAA football. The long-standing economic problems of the South, which are greatly a result of stubbornly entrenched systems of racism and classism, will make it so they can't afford to take advantage of players in their own backyards like they used to. In northern and western blue states, which by the way have always been the states with more money. Like, it's funny how people, you know, of certain political backgrounds will talk about government handouts and welfare in the South, when the South has literally been getting the most government support and welfare from blue states for literal generations. Those northern and coastal blue states are going to start dominating based solely off of having more money in their states. I expect the SEC and all the Southern teams to take huge steps back over the next decade as their players start to go elsewhere for better deals. Teams with richer endowments and teams with more solidified cultures will begin to dominate because they will be able to either get the best players more consistently, or they'll be able to keep their players for longer. And if you thought it was weird that SMU, Southern Methodist University, a smaller school, randomly got to the college football playoff after being nothing for decades after their own cheating scandal in the 80s, that's because they're one of the few teams in the South with a ton of money in their endowment that they can use to pay those players. So they will definitely build up their team, and they will probably be a perennial powerhouse going forward. So get ready for the era of teams like SMU, Duke, maybe being college football powerhouses in the South, and say goodbye to the reign of Alabama and LSU, Tennessee, and maybe even Georgia pretty soon. The only way this is going to change is for the NCAA to ironically adopt the low-key socialist practices of the NFL, where teams share profit and pool all their funds together to make sure that poorer teams in smaller markets like Cincinnati or the Raiders are able to use resources from bigger market teams teams like Houston, New York, and Los Angeles to compete at the same level on a level playing field. It's really funny how the super rich don't tell each other to pull themselves up by the bootstraps when it's time for them to work together to accomplish things and make more money. But I'm sure that if something like that did happen with NCAA football, there would still be a way for them to figure out how to exploit the players, because that's low-key what the NFL does. It is what it is, but still, it's going to be an interesting outcome to see what college football looks like if this trend continues. That's it, y'all. Thank you for staying this whole time to watch me talk about sports. I know for some of you, this isn't your thing, but go ahead, share it in your sports circle so it can get out of the left tube, red tube pocket and into the pockets where it probably is going to be more interesting. That's all I got for y'all today. I'm FD Signifier, and this has been Light Work.